everybody, and welcome to this year's COP29 briefing brought to you by the Ryan Institute at the University of Galway and our Master's Programme in Climate Change, Agriculture and Food Security. My name is Charlie Spillane. I'm the professor at the university. I'm the director of the Master's Programme in Climate Change, Agriculture and Food Security here at our university. Each year for the last number of climate COP summits, we've been asking our students on the Master's Programme to prepare briefings throughout the COP meetings, one briefing at the beginning, one midway through, and one towards the end, really just to get our students to engage in the process, but also to research and analyze and try and understand from the outside looking in what is happening at these successive COP meetings, which are critical for climate action on our planet. And then in conjunction with that, what we do is we invite a range of guests who are here at the COP meeting and who are here in COP29 in Baku, to give their reflections on how they consider the process to be progressing to date. So I'm going to hand over to the students in a moment, but I'll just say a few words in relation to these climate change summits. Right. So it's about 30 years have passed since the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change came into force, and it's almost 10 years now since the 2015 Paris Agreement was agreed. And the Paris Agreement was critical to identifying targets of 2 degrees and ideally 1.5 degrees by end of century to get climate action that would reduce emissions so that we would stay within that temperature envelope. But the reality that we face in these successive COPs is that our governments keep meeting while emissions keep rising. The International Energy Agency, the World Meteorological Organization, the emissions report, all are pointing to the fact that emissions keep rising. 1.5 degrees is probably no longer possible, and 2 degrees seems increasingly difficult to achieve. We're on trajectories of possibly 3 degrees or more by end of century. So there's somewhat of a disconnect between the negotiations, the pace of the negotiations, the urgency of the negotiations, and the state of emissions on our planet, essentially. So what are these COP climates? Basically, climate summits. We have a process here where we have governments negotiating with each other to come up with agreements between governments on the climate actions that are necessary in relation to mitigation, adaptation, and a just transition. So there's a political process of legal negotiations of international policy. But in parallel with that, to the intergovernmental negotiations, there's also a wide range of non-state actors like NGOs, like private sector, civil society organizations, and so forth, who are also engaged in activities and partnership building. So these are very large and complex events. There's about 66,000 people from about 3,700 organizations registered for COP29. And of those, about over 30,000 are associated with the government delegations, and the rest from observer delegations and technical staff and so forth. So quite large, complex organizations. And it's in some ways a challenge for the students, but also for anybody involved in these processes to follow the multiple tracks of negotiations that are happening here. This particular COP29 is overshadowed by a range of geopolitical events that have the potential to weaken the political process necessary for climate action that's urgently needed if we are to reduce emissions dramatically by 2030 and to net zero by 2030, while in turn strengthening the ability of the most climate vulnerable to adapt to climate change in the necessary timeframe. There's a couple of really big ticket items under negotiation here that the students and our commentators will almost certainly comment on. One of which is about finance. This is considered to be the finance COP. So there's this concept of a new collective quantified goal on climate finance, which is probably the biggest issue on the table at COP29. And this is really about updating from a figure of $100 billion US dollars per annum required by 2030, which was in the post-2015 Paris Agreement period, to a new figure, which is dramatically higher anywhere. Currently, the kind of thinking is that developing countries have identified a figure of about $1.3 trillion needed for climate finance by 2030. So there's negotiations about how much, who pays, what the mechanisms of accessing or distribution of that. And ideally at this COP29, it's expected that a total goal should be agreed. Then in parallel, there's negotiations about a global goal on adaptation and metrics and indicators around measuring that. There's parallel negotiations on mitigation, on loss and damage, just transition, carbon markets, and so forth. So there are many parallel tracks here, and there's lots of different constituencies here who are following specific tracks. All of the world's governments under the Paris Agreement have to submit what are called nationally determined contributions, which are essentially climate national action plans. But many of these are not displaying the ambition that is required to reduce the emissions at the rate necessary. And so there was an expectation that they would ratchet up their ambition year on year with successive NDCs that they submit, but that seems to be flatlining, in fact, receding in many cases. So basically, at this COP, the current kind of mood, I think, is a bit somber in the sense that the progress seems to be extremely slow on many fronts, and from ways many things being kicked forward to June or shelved until June 2025, and many topics unresolved with a lot of major disagreement. But I'm going to hand over now to our students. So we have a master's program in climate change, agriculture, and food security. The students have broken up into 3 different groups. This is group 2, and I'm going to hand over to David and Sinéad, who will give their briefing on their analysis of the process so far within COP29. So over to you, David and Sinéad. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, my name is David King, and I'm a master's student here at the University of Galway in the Climate Change, Agriculture, and Food Security program. So thanks to Professor Spillane and the Ryan Institute for hosting this. So our group, there's 5 of us here, and we have been trying to follow the negotiations, a lot of different things happening in parallel. But what quickly became obvious at the beginning of the conference was that it was going to be a very difficult, slow process, like Professor Spillane mentioned. On Monday of last week, sessions immediately began to stall, and there began to be like huge disagreements on the adoption of the agendas, predetermined frameworks for negotiations. Many developing nations and negotiating blocs protested a lack of transparency in the formation of those draft texts and proposals. So this kind of set the stage for how the whole week was going to go in most regards. And there's also, on the political side of things, the election of Donald Trump, which he's a climate skeptic and has previously pulled out of the Paris Agreement in his initial term. His election has generated a lot of discussion, and U.S. officials having to reaffirm commitment to climate goals. There are also many political leaders absent from around the world, which could be seen as a damaging to the success of the conference. As well, in addition to this, we saw the Argentinian delegation withdraw from COP29 halfway through the week. So our first topic that I'll talk about has kind of a central part in these negotiations, at least for the last week. The global stock take, which was completed last year in 2023. This is the first COP where that what that means and how it's implemented is kind of being worked out in real time. So, this concluded at COP28, and the next one will be 5 years after. And it's important for understanding what progress countries and parties and the world has made towards the goals of the Paris Agreement. And there is immediate disagreement on how the outcomes of the global stocktake should be implemented. So what kinds of actions should be taken to incorporate the findings from the global stocktake, and also how should they be implemented, whether the global stocktake should be an overarching kind of meta discussion or influence in all the different programs for the Paris Agreement throughout COP. This became a huge point of contention and ended up stalling a lot of negotiations with respect to the framework for how to move forward. However, there were some side events, in particular concerning the long-term emissions development strategy of countries that did generate some level of agreement. But that largely still remains to be seen how that gets incorporated in the future. One big ticket item that happened at the beginning of COP early in the week last week was an agreement on some of the standards for the international carbon credit market. This has been worked on for many years, and the rules were finally set and accepted. However, this didn't come without controversy, particularly with many country blocs in the developing world criticizing it for being rushed through at the beginning and not conforming to values of multilateralism. There's also a huge disagreement on the scope of oversight, how exactly this market interfaces with national sovereignty and what happens internally to nations. That became a huge point of disagreement and stalled negotiations as well. As with the global stocktake, however, there were side events outside of the core negotiations that have yielded some promising aspects involving the joint crediting mechanism with actors like multilateral development banks facilitating some discussion around on the outside, on the periphery. Now, the big highlight ticket item for COP29, as Professor Spillane mentioned, is the new collective quantified goal in CQG, which basically represents the new targets for climate finance. And this being the finance COP, and this being one of the main finance discussions, this was immediately fraught with lots of disagreement as well. Developing countries initially rejected the framework around the NCQG dialogues, again citing that it doesn't reflect multilateral process that's representative of the developing nations' positions. And this kind of continued throughout the week as different revisions and things like that and informal notes were released and revised, and it was very slow going. But in general, the general consensus is that the quantum or the amount of finance that we have to spend yearly should be in the trillions, anywhere from 1 to 1.8 trillion USD per year by 2030. Many countries citing the 1.3 trillion number in particular. There's also a low level of agreement for some critical details concerning the NCQG. What's included, is loss and damage finance for countries already experiencing the effects of climate change. Is that included in it? Also issues with double counting finance under this umbrella, in addition to it being counted in other areas. So lots of disagreement there. Lots of country blocs also are debating around the question of what is the donor base, who is supposed to be financing all of this money, with developing country blocs in particular, or developed country blocs rather, saying that the donor base should maybe be expanded to what was previously established to include more country and economies that can contribute. And the makeup of these funds is also hugely up for debate as well. How much is it public finance versus private finance? Some countries are insisting that there should be an investment layer, which would be that private finance in addition to a baseline, and that's how the distribution of funds should pan out. There's also a lot of concern from developing countries that they want to make sure that it is not placing additional debt burdens on their countries and their economies as well. So this is the big ticket item of the Finance COP, and it's very much in the middle of negotiations, so not a lot of clear results from that yet. But as mentioned here on this slide as well, the COP29 presidency, there was a statement due for today. So we will see how it pans out from today and throughout the next week. One final actually disagreement or concern that some countries have is the clear designation of a timeline for the quantified goal for these funds. So it should be yearly, but there has been some concern about that as well. And then finally, I'll talk about the loss and damage funds, which is also right in the middle of it. Not a lot of conclusions as of yet, but there is progress being made on the fund, which was established at last year's COP28. But it's hugely controversial in many of the same ways as I've discussed around other finance topics. So who pays, how it gets implemented, making sure it's not double counted, making sure it is distributed equitably and to the most vulnerable communities that need it. But there was an announcement at the end of last week that it should be operational. The loss and damage fund should be operational at the end of this COP. So that's all I have. I'll hand it over to my colleague Snelletta to continue the discussion.
Thank you, David. And now I will discuss about the gender and equity. The Lima Work Program on Gender is currently under review. Final decision is expected from COP29. It is established to promote gender balance in policies into climate action. The Enhanced Gender Action Plan outlines objective and activities aims to advance knowledge and understanding of gender. For example, capacity building, knowledge management, gender balance, women's leadership, monitoring, and reporting. This week on Thursday, event will highlight the importance and benefit of gender, and the day is called COP29 Gender Equality Day. Next slide, please. Now I'll talk about the mitigation at COP29. Urgency of emission reduction. First and foremost, the emissions are the primary cause of climate change. There has been notable disagreement between parties and stakeholders on the role of fossil fuel. The host country president's statement praising fossil fuel as a gift of God drew significant criticism and sparked heated debates. There has been 6 additional countries that are committed to triple their nuclear power capacity by 2050. The countries are El Salvador, Nigeria, Turkey, Kosovo, Kenya, and Tajikistan. This move highlights the shift towards alternative energy sources in an effort to reduce carbon emission. Despite the increasing emission, there was a general consensus on maintaining the temperature at 1.5 degrees Celsius. The target is essential for limiting the most severe impact of climate change. There is a strong commitment to increase ambition and action to achieve it. One of the highly contested topics was the continue of international aviation emission. It was decided to defer further assessment of this issue until July 2025 for more comprehensive evaluation. Next slide, please. Now, a global goal on adaptation, a key topic. A key focus at COP29 has been on operationalizing the global goal on adaptation to enhance adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, and reducing vulnerability to climate change. There has been an ongoing process and debate about defining adaptation indicators. These indicators are vital for measuring progress and ensuring effective adaptation actions are implemented. This delay highlights the complexities involved in evaluating and enhancing the committee's effectiveness in guiding global adaptation efforts. It appears that national adaptation plan discussion still need successful outcomes at COP29. These plans are essential for countries to outline their adaptation priorities and strategies. Parties have opposed any reference to the notion of transformational adaptation. This opposition reflects the diverse view on the scale and nature of adaptation required to address climate change impacts. Next slide, please. Multitude of climate topics and activities underway at COP29. At COP29, both government, states, and non-state actors are actively engaged in shaping the future of climate action. Government states are primarily focused on negotiating international law and policies that will drive global climate efforts. Meanwhile, non-state actors contribute through advocacy, innovation, and implementing on-the-ground solutions. Here are the examples of many other important topics being discussed at COP29: early warning system, climate finance, just transition work program. Next slide, please. Climate action advocacy and activism. The powerful statement from UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres recently addressed the frustration of youth advocates over the lack of climate action. The statement resonates with the urgent need for accelerated efforts in addressing climate change. A remarkable NGOs have registered to attend COP29, represented by 10,000 delegates. These organizations span various sectors, showcasing the diverse and comprehensive approach needed to tackle climate challenges. The NGOs participating at COP29 cover a wide range of sectors and topics, including climate action, energy, agriculture, water, youth, gender, and many more. Next slide, please. So far, there has been very slow political negotiating progress on multiple issues at COP29. This has raised concern about the effectiveness and urgency of our collective climate action efforts. The absence of leaders from countries such as USA, China, and India has been notable. Their presence and leadership are crucial for driving global climate commitment and actions. There has been significant disagreement on multiple topics at COP29 that highlights the complexities and differing priorities among parties and stakeholders. So, where is urgency and ambitions from our political leaders? We must hold our leaders accountable and demand climate justice to ensure a sustainable and resilient future for all. Thank you. Now I'll pass over to Professor Spillane.
So thanks so much to you and to David and indeed all your group for putting in the effort to do your analysis and your develop a briefing on the COP29 so far. It's quite challenging to do. I can understand that, and it's also difficult to follow from the outside looking in, but it's also difficult to follow from the inside looking out. I'm sure you. So what we've done is we have a range of commentators who are here at COP29 that I've invited to kind of give their perspectives on how they see the negotiations proceeding. I've got we've got lined up here. We have Maurice Sadlier from World Vision International, Sinéad Loughran from Trócaire, Ross Fitzpatrick from Christian Aid, Tom Corringham, who's from the Ocean Pavilion from the Scripps Institute of Oceanography, and also we may have some others joining, but I think we've got four very able commentators here. We'd really like to hear what your thoughts are about how you feel COP29 is going. If you want, you can introduce the topic, your own organization, and the topic of why you're here and what the topics are that you're most motivated by, or why you're here essentially. And then also what you consider to be the major progress or lack thereof at COP29 so far at this point of the negotiations. So I think I'll start with Maurice from Maurice Sadlier and hand over to you, Maurice, and then after that I think I'll go to Tom Corringham, then to Sinead, and I'll finish with Ross, if that's okay. So over to you, Maurice, and you can take a bit of time to introduce, as you wish. Okay, over to you.
Thanks, Charlie. Yeah, Maurice Sadlier here from World Vision Ireland, so Director of Programs and Policy. And World Vision is very much here, I suppose, as World Vision Ireland in solidarity and supporting our colleagues from the small island developing states. So we have some colleagues from Solomon Islands here, and our focus particularly on child hunger and the interaction with climate change, which is kind of a symptom of the overall systemic failure and climate crisis, and looking at it then from a top-down process of where all these different elements that are being discussed here and how they interact with the islands. But I think following up maybe on some of the really good presentations from the students just now, I think maybe we had a really, I suppose, I wouldn't say good, there was a closing plenary of the subsidiary bodies earlier today, and then COP and CMA and CMP reopened. And while there is, I suppose, not huge progress in relation to the big ticket items, I did sit thinking, well, there were 7 or 8 decisions gabbled through. So while progress is slow in many elements, some of the other procedural elements are being worked on and moved on. But I was talking to a colleague who works for World Vision and sits on the negotiation team of a Southern African country earlier. And our general sense is that while the MScCCAFS discussions are ongoing, people are either afraid or just not willing to make progress on many of the other decisions. And I saw that myself at the Bonn Intersessional and again here this week, where when finance comes up, people do not want to make a decision around finance because that sets a precedent, or they feel it sets a cross-reference to another decision being taken. So I think a lot of hands are waiting for the MScCCAFS to progress before they make decisions on any of the other sort of processes. But the COP president did set out sort of a way forward today for moving ahead with the negotiations, particularly around the MScCCAFS, mitigation, adaptation, and Article 6. And Egypt and Australia have been set as a ministerial pair to discuss over the next few days with all the negotiation blocks around the structure, the quantum, and the contributors, which are the 3 main blockages for the MScCCAFS. So that will be progressed. He kind of set out a stall of a number of ministerial pairs, negotiators. So Minister Ryan, along with Costa Rica, will focus around sort of adaptation and the goal there. And then at the same time, technical discussions will go on in a number of areas. And just to pick up, I have a particular interest in the procedure and the procedural processes around the UNFCCC and COPs and how those work. And I think there was a reference there to the gender decision that has to be taken. There was no conclusion at the subsidiary bodies around the gender decision to be taken. And my understanding is that comes from a human rights perspective. So people are concerned about some of the language, particularly around LGBT rights, that may be perceived to be included into that process. So it's interesting how, and we were discussing this yesterday, Development Climate Days, how an overall closing of human rights norms and the human rights space is having an impact on negotiations and how those are perceived. So while people don't say it openly, it is this closing space internationally for rights and rights-based approaches and protection of human rights is creeping into the process in the place that it's not necessarily, it has always been here, but maybe not as much. I just left the Just Transition ministerial dialogue, and I think there's some interesting points there from the Minister of Colombia, who basically said, which country is going to be first to put their economy on the line when it comes to this just transition? And I think there was a lot of discussion around the need for finance, capacity, sharing, and technology. And that's required across the board, both from a just transition, mitigation, and adaptation process. And that then permeates across all the different decisions that are outstanding or those need to be made, and talks back to the actual need of the finance decision, because without the new quantified goal, there isn't necessarily the means of implementation for any of these processes. So I think that's a huge part of it. So the finance is the main topic, but it is the driver for every other decision and every other aspect that has to be taken here. And an area particular just for World Vision then is around children, both child participation and funding for child-focused actions. And earlier, UNICEF presented a figure of 2.4% of multilateral climate finance goes for children. So they're calling not just for the closing of a climate finance gap, but a climate finance gap for children. But interestingly, they presented this again back to procedural processes at what they called an intergenerational dialogue, which I don't necessarily think you can have very many dialogues in the COP space, to be honest, because it is everyone just says their piece and that's it. So dialogue is limited in ways. But also there was one child among a panel of 8 or 9 people. So again, it's looking at what do we mean by meaningful participation and a process that is fit for purpose for participation and taking other people's opinions on board, especially if we are to increase access to finance for many communities and many sort of vulnerable groups, then they need to be involved in some of these processes as well. But that's it for now. I'll pass over to some of my other colleagues who sure have a lot more to say.
Maurice, thanks so much, and thanks for bringing up the question of rights and the challenges of rights and the imperative of rights-based approaches. I think next we might hand over to Tom Corringham. And thanks, Tom, for joining us. Tom is at the Ocean Pavilion. He's the Scripps Institute of Oceanography, and again, the Ocean Pavilion is the intersection between ocean and climate. And maybe Tom can kind of give us an intro as to why that's important, and what's important for the Ocean Pavilion at COP29. Over to you,
Sure,
Tom.
yeah. Thank you, Professor Spillane. It's a little noisy here. I'm in the Ocean Pavilion, but I'm in our back room, so hopefully you can hear me and the background noise
Perfect.
isn't too much. And thank you, David, Sinéad, for really excellent overviews of the topics at hand and at stake at the COP. And thanks, Maurice, for the analysis, which I also found very illuminating. I think I will just start. Well, I'll give an overview of some of the topics that we are interested in here at the Oceans Pavilion. But first, I just wanted to pick up on a couple of comments that others have made. So Professor Spillane at the beginning mentioned, well, I think you're all aware of the MScCCAFS, the agreement on a Green Climate Fund at Copenhagen, where developed countries would transfer $100 billion a year to developing countries by 2020. There's been some debate over whether that's actually been met, but the OECD says that we did meet that goal by 2022. And now at the Finance COP, there's this discussion over the MScCCAFS and the quantum. As Professor Spillane mentioned, the target for the G77 is $1.3 trillion a year. And when I first heard these numbers, they were a little abstract to me. So just to put them in context, the global GDP, the global product, what we produce every year as a planet, is on the order of $100 trillion a year. So $100 billion a year, what the previous goal is only 1/1000th of what we produce every year. And $1.3 trillion a year sounds like a huge number. It is a large number. It's not insignificant, but it is only about 1% of what we produce every year. So I just wanted to put that into perspective. So US GDP is about 20 to 25 trillion a year. Ireland is about $500 billion a year. So that maybe helps put some of these numbers in context. From where I'm sitting for this COP, it was billed the Finance COP. I think a lot of people are seeing it now as the placeholder COP. A lot of the discussions seem to be waiting for Belém next year. So we'll see. We'll see what comes out of this COP. There was an initial, there was some progress on Article 6, which I think was mentioned earlier, on carbon trading. That was gavelled through on the first day. So that was encouraging. But since then, there's been some dispute surrounding that issue. I think there's been a little bit of progress on adaptation. Beyond that, I mean, we'll have to see. I'm not terribly hopeful about MScCCAFS. But here in the Ocean Pavilion, our main objective is to get the discussion of the ocean into the negotiating process, into the text that is agreed upon at these different COPs. So until recently, there was no mention of the ocean in the agreements, but there is a mention of the ocean in the Paris Agreement. There's more emphasis on the ocean in the global stocktake, and our goal is to continue that progress towards considering the ocean in these climate negotiations. So just to give my pitch for the ocean, there are a number of reasons the ocean is important. The ocean and the atmosphere are both fluids, and they interact in important ways. The ocean is the biggest climate regulator on Earth. It absorbs about 25% of CO2 emissions. It has absorbed over 90% of the excess heat caused by climate change. And it is a key element in the carbon cycle. So anything that we do to the climate has impacts on the ocean. Anything we do in the ocean has impacts on the climate. An example would be as CO2 levels increase, well, with warming, we see warming ocean temperatures, which leads to the intensification of storms, for example, of hurricanes and typhoons. With increased CO2 concentrations, it lowers the pH of the ocean. So we have ocean acidification, and that affects coral reefs, it affects ocean ecosystems. With the rising temperatures, we have the melting of the polar ice caps, and we also have steric expansion of the oceans themselves. So we see sea level rise. That does vary regionally. Some areas, the sea level rise is greater than others, but that's a significant concern for obvious reasons for coastal communities around the planet. There are projections of sea level rise out to 2100, and there's a lot of uncertainty in the long term as to what will happen, mainly with the Arctic and Antarctic ice sheets and ice shelves. So we'll see what happens. If we can limit warming to 1.5 degrees, which I think Professor Spillane was right, is probably unrealistic at this point. But if we could limit to 2 degrees, then we stand a better chance of staving off the worst possible sea level rise impacts. I think I've used a lot of my time, so I'll just mention a few other things, a few other topics we're interested in. Blue carbon, so mangroves and seagrass can sequester carbon. Fisheries are obviously important. We're seeing migration of fish species. If you're a small island developing state and you depend on a tuna fishery, for example, in your waters, as that fishery moves forward, you lose revenue from fisheries. There are just so many topics that I think that are central to the oceans: ocean pollution, ocean biodiversity, the connections between the different conventions, so not just the UN Conference of Parties at the UNFCCC, but also the Convention on Biodiversity, CBD. They just had their COP16 in Cali in Colombia a couple of weeks ago. So there's actually talk at this COP about bringing the treaties together, considering biodiversity, considering climate, considering desertification altogether. So I think there's a lot of progress that's being made, at least on considering the ocean in the climate debate and in the climate space, which I find encouraging. But there's a lot more to be done, and interested to see what happens at the rest of the COP. Thank you.
Tom, thanks so much for giving that great overview of why the oceans are important to the climate question and the climate crisis. We really appreciate your time here today, and it's really good that you could connect to the other speakers as well. I've a slight change in the kind of running order here, so we're going to go over next to Ross Fitzpatrick from Christian Aid, and then we'll go to Sinéad Loughran from Trócaire. So thank you again, Tom, and over to you, Ross.
Thanks a million, Charlie, for that, and I'll try to keep my intervention relatively short. I think pretty much everything has been covered already, and thanks to the students for the really excellent presentations. So I'm a policy and advocacy officer at Christian Aid, and I attend COP every year with colleagues to try and influence the negotiations and to push Irish ministers in particular to take a leading and progressive role in the talks. Looking back over the first week, I think it'd be an understatement rather to say the mood is one of pessimism and frustration. You mentioned in your opening that there's a real disconnect between the pace of negotiations and the scientific reality of climate change and the impacts we're seeing every day. I think that's even more true than usual in Baku. I think the most disappointing aspect of the first week has been the really slow progress in the finance negotiations. And I'm conscious your other speakers and the students have touched on this a good bit already. But just to say, I spent most of my week in various negotiating rooms following the talks, and despite hours spent on various parts of the draft text, countries are still extremely divided on the key issues. It is worth saying, though, it's not unusual for technical negotiations to advance particularly slowly in the opening week of a COP. In fact, that's pretty much the norm. But to put things into context on how far apart countries are, one of our partners, Power Shift Africa, and you might be familiar with him, Mohamed Adew, he's been at 15 COPs, and he described the first week of this COP as the worst first week he's ever experienced. So yeah, I just wanted to go into a little bit more detail on the NCQG and the kind of two main fundamental questions that are dividing countries, they've been mentioned already. So the first one is how much money is needed, or the quantum, and then the second one, which countries should be paying the bill. So on the first question, developing countries and NGOs like ourselves are calling for at least 1 trillion a year in public climate finance to be provided by rich countries in the global north, including Ireland, to help them adapt to climate change and cut their emissions. While the 1 trillion figure does seem kind of astronomical, but Tom mentioned how small this is in relation to kind of global GDP. It's also worth pointing out that the fossil fuel industry has made around $1 trillion in profits per year for the last 50 years. So in relation to both of those figures, it's actually quite achievable and kind of a bargain. Developed countries, including Ireland, are saying that public money isn't available, or the scale of public finance isn't available. So they're pushing for the new goal to include various layers, including investment and private finance. But we know that private finance has proven really inefficient, and it can't adequately tackle some of the aspects of climate change that we're focused on, such as adaptation and loss and damage, because private finance tends to go towards projects which can deliver a return on investment, and that's not the case with adaptation and loss and damage. The second question with regard to which countries should be paying the bill. So developing countries who are defined as such under the UN FCCC are calling for the goal to be provided by developed countries in line with their historical responsibility for causing the crisis. Rich countries, on the other hand, are arguing that the new finance goal can only be reached if certain countries which are currently defined as developing, but are now kind of major economic powers and emissions producers themselves. So they're arguing if the new goal can only be reached if those countries are added to the list of climate finance contributors. Developing countries see this basically as an attempt to shift the burden of responsibility and point the finger at others, all the while delaying the provision of funding to those who need it now. One of the presenters earlier on used the term donor base to describe this kind of debate. But actually that language is quite problematic for a lot of developing countries, because what we're talking about here is not charitable donations, but actual obligations to contribute finance. So it's really important to make that distinction when we're talking about climate finance. We're talking about contributions, not donations. So yeah, we've got 1 week left now to find a breakthrough, and the finance talks will go to ministerial level, and it's up to ministers to essentially find a compromise on the text. COP outcomes are always based on consensus, so what you usually end up with is a lowest common denominator approach, and there's certainly a feeling that this is what is likely to happen with the decision on the new finance goal. Expectations are really, really low. What we want to see over the next week, I suppose, is for Ireland to use its voice within the EU negotiating bloc to push for a new goal that is based on climate justice and doesn't simply go along with the kind of default EU position to date, which has been very, very focused on this question of expanding the contributor base and mobilizing private finance and looking at how investment can contribute to the goal, rather than the kind of clear obligation under the key climate treaties for rich countries to provide this finance. Unfortunately, based on the first week, Ireland has been pretty content not to rock the boat at all with respect to the EU negotiating position, despite pretty positive rhetoric on the need for climate justice. So hopefully in the next week, we can see them bridging that gap somewhat. Minister Ryan has said that he sees his role at COP as bridging the gap between global South and global North. So yeah, I think that kind of covers it from my side. I'll stop there. Thanks, Charlie.
Ross, thanks so much, and that was a very clear kind of overview of the various kind of tensions around the climate finance aspects that are really at stake here. Thanks again, Ross, and I'm going to hand over now to Sinead as our kind of last speaker, Sinead Loughran from Trócaire, and then I'll wrap things up. Okay, so over to you, Sinead. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Charlie. Yeah, so just following on from Ross's points on the NCQG and the new climate finance goal, I'll talk specifically about one area within that, and that's the loss and damage sub-goal. So there are a number of reasons why loss and damage needs to be included as a sub-goal in the NCQG, and that's related to the responsibilities outlined in the Paris Agreement. So you have Article 9 of the Paris Agreement stating that developed countries must take into consideration and account the needs and priorities of developing countries, and loss and damage is a clear need and priority of developing countries. The fund for responding to loss and damage actually exists already under the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, so it makes complete sense that this new finance goal would actually incorporate loss and damage in there as well. And it highlights the evolution of, I suppose, of finance and climate finance within the UNFCCC over the last number of years. It also links to other key areas of the COP work that's underway, and particularly in relation to Minister Ryan's work as one of the co-chairs on adaptation. So essentially, we know that the EU recognises that currently, because we don't have an operationalised loss and damage fund or funders for responding to loss and damage, that loss and damage needs are actually being provided for, but labelled now provided for on a very minimal level at that, but being labelled as adaptation finance. So ultimately you have adaptation and loss and damage relying on the same pot of money, while they are some of the greatest needs within the whole climate finance sector. They're critically underfunded, and you have the same pool of money being drawn upon for the same for two different pillars of climate finance. So ultimately, we don't just need a loss and damage sub-goal for loss and damage needs, we also need a loss and damage sub-goal to protect the adaptation funding that is critically underfunded right now. And the other kind of point around this as well is that it's very much a political decision as to whether loss and damage gets included as a sub-goal in the NCQG. And for years, loss and damage as a term was politically rejected. So there's no reason why it can't be included. And for all the reasons that I've just mentioned, it absolutely should be included. It's a matter of climate justice as well. You know, loss and damage is has been caused because not enough climate action has been taken fast enough or adequately enough. And we're now in this period of loss and damage that will continue for the foreseeable and into the future. So Ireland has played a very positive and strong role in loss and damage previously. So it's really quite disappointing to see that Ireland isn't willing to go beyond the EU's position right now, which is to absolutely have no sub-goals at all in the NCQG. So it's not just worrying for loss and damage, but also for adaptation as well. So yeah, that's kind of one area that we would really like to see Ireland to step beyond the EU's position, and for the EU to really address that. That kind of shortfall in their positioning as well. We heard Minister Ryan say last week during his high-level ministerial dialogue that keeping the Paris Agreement alive and is really the important work that all of the negotiators had to do here at COP29. And ultimately, loss and damage is part of the Paris Agreement, and it's really keeping that alive and keeping that to the center of their work requires loss and damage as a sub-goal. One other point is that loss and damage has really been pushed to the sidelines in this COP. Like, it was the major kind of win on day one of COP last year, and we can see very clearly right now that it's not prioritized in this COP. And one of the major kind of reflections or things that really highlights that so clearly is because last week during a pledging event that was scheduled for Tuesday, and it was entitled a pledging event, only one pledge was actually made during that pledging event. So Sweden pledged $19 million, which took the total pledges for the loss and damage fund to just over $720 million to date. In reality, the needs are around 400 billion per year, so about 0.2% of the actual needs has been pledged so far. Other countries that were present simply signed their pledges into contributions. That was the kind of action that they took at those events, at that event. So we can already see the danger and the risk of not including loss and damage in the NCQG is that it's completely pushed to the sidelines and doesn't have the same attention that it should have if it's not included in the overall new climate finance goal. And just one other point, I guess, is that while there has been a lot of progress made by the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage and the board that was set up this year to really start operationalising that fund, part of the negotiations is to provide a report on the fund back to the COP on the parties of the Paris Agreement. There is a negotiation this evening on that. Many developed countries simply wanted to acknowledge the work that the board had completed this year and commend them for the work that they had done. Others felt that there should have been guidance included in that report, as is required under that reporting mechanism within the COP process every year. And the board ultimately will have a lot of work to continue doing after this COP, specifically around access modalities. So of particular interest there for civil society organisations in developing countries is the direct access window for the fund. So those who need it and most can actually access directly to the fund, and also the participation of active observers. So far during the board meetings this year, that hasn't been to the standard that reflects genuine participation or access to decision-making processes for those whose lives are affected by those very decisions. So rights holders and marginalised groups haven't had the kind of opportunity to participate in the way that they should have had under proper standards of participation. So that's just a few kind of points on loss and damage, and I think really to reflect back on kind of some of the narratives that we've seen. The EU, and like as Ross mentioned, Ireland's quite content to go by the EU's positioning. The EU is conveying a very different narrative in their public statements and in the proposals that they're putting forward for the NCQG, for loss and damage and so on. So ultimately it's about trying to really hold them to account on that as well. And like one of the statements that the EU made earlier today was that the COP presidency really needs to take the lead and steer all parties into a safe landing space. But the EU has a very clear role to play here too, and all of the member states as part of that, and that's to step up and pay their fair share of climate finance and take their fair share of climate action. And the reality is that even though the EU stated today that they've always paid their fair share and they've actually they've always done their fair share and gone beyond their fair share, the reality is no one has ever paid their fair share for climate finance. The 100 billion goal, as inadequate as it was, has never actually been reached because the vast majority of it has been provided in loans. So no party has actually provided their fair share, and it's really holding all of the parties to account, and especially the ones where we have access to the decision makers as well. So I'll finish up there because I realise we're kind of short on time.
Thanks so much, Sinead. That's really great, and it's really good to get the perspective on loss and damage. And we've just been joined by one of my colleagues, Marie from the Master International Development Practice at the University of Galway, who's also here at COP29. And maybe we just get a few brief interjections from yourself, Una, as to how you consider the COP29 negotiations to be going, and then we'll definitely wrap up. Okay, over to you.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, I'm at a bit of a disadvantage because I didn't hear your what went on earlier, so I'm not going to say that much except give a bit of perspective of what I've been doing today. First of all, there was a feminist demand for climate justice, quite a lot on kind of the gender dimensions of climate displacement in negotiations. I've been spending quite a bit of time in the Just Transition Pavilion, where there's been a lot of discussion on how can we accelerate skills for green transition, just economy, human rights-based approach. And there was quite, what I'm really following is human mobility and how that is reflected in the key outcome documents. And there's a coalition, different coalition groups of us who are working on that or who are following that. There's the IOM pavilion where we meet in the morning and discuss, but there's also a human mobility pavilion. And today there was actually a high level event by run by the president of Azerbaijan, where they did talk about how many people may have to move or may move to cities as a result of climate change. and just kind of trying to make the linkages. There was just there now, there was a discussion on social protection and investment in social protections or funds for social protection, and it was quite a high level event as well, with the big funds there, Green Climate Fund, the GEF and the German GIZ are funding quite a lot of that. It was run by UNICEF, but the linkages are not there about mobility and social protection. There's kind of an assumption that people are static, and once they've been registered, they'll stay where they are, rather than thinking about human mobility in terms of circular migration, seasonal migration, migration as an adaptation response, but maybe not forever. So the groups that I'm collaborating with here, we're following these discussions and trying to get human mobility higher up the text, including in the indicators on adaptation and global stock take and the outcome document. I'll stop there because I'm at the disadvantage of not having heard what went on earlier, and I'm really looking forward to watching the video later. Thanks. Back to you, Charlie.
Thanks very much, Una, and thanks to really all of our invited panelists here who are here at COP28. It's really great to see everybody's focus on different topics and how much they're on top of all of the kind of topics. Firstly, I'd like to really thank the students for putting together an excellent presentation. It's a very complex thing to follow, and they've done a really great job in relation to that. And it's really then to get the counterpoint of the people here and to get their kind of detailed knowledge of what's happening on the ground. So that's really been really great. I guess there's a lot at stake, clearly. What's really at stake really is the future of people and the planet. And, you know, when you put it in that context, even though the finance quantums seem large, they're finance quantums that relate to people and the future of humanity. And there are really strong questions of intergenerational equity here at play, because our politicians and our policymakers are making decisions here and at these various COPs that really will dictate what the future of the planet will be for their children's grandchildren. And if they don't make the right decisions and mitigate and reduce emissions quickly enough, then they're really destining future generations to a planet that will be very difficult for humanity, or more difficult for humanity to thrive and prosper in. So really, there's a lot on their shoulders, but they do have a political mandate, and they should probably step up to that mandate in terms of accelerating both mitigation, adaptation, and just transition, because that mandate will only be increasing for all of our politicians and policymakers over time. So hopefully we'll see more progress at this rather slow COP29 by the end of the week. But at that, I think we'll close the sessions. Say thanks to our students, thanks to Ciara Varley as well, who's our communications officer, for putting together all of this, and really, and thanks again to our speakers for taking the time out to give us their excellent perspective. So thank you, and we're going to have our last and third briefing on Thursday, this coming Thursday, where our third group of students will give their presentation on what has happened in the intervening period. So hopefully we'll have better news then. Okay, thank you all.